Hello everybody, and welcome to the part 2 of the Accelerating the Implementation of Renewable Energy Project webinar series. My name is Eric Timmons. I'm the senior lead of Community Resilience here at Quest and the lead for this project. Before we get going, if there are any questions throughout today's presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat box. There's also a Q&A feature on the webinar today, so either one, I'll be monitoring both throughout. We can answer them as they go along if we need to, but there will also be allotted time for questions at the end of today's session. A little background, a little intro before we get going. So the AIRE project at Quest is developed and delivered in partnership with the University of Guelph and the Community Energy Knowledge Action Partnership. And is also presented through our funding partner, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So this project focuses on changing policies, changing regulations, plans, and behaviors in order to enable the reduction of municipal emissions. And this is done through mobilizing the adoption of different technologies, different processes, or practices with the goal of assisting the implementation of renewable energy in our participating municipalities. So our webinar today focuses on another key piece of that process. What is the role of the municipality? So this presentation will discuss the ever-changing role of the municipality in the energy supply planning and system implementation. We'll go at it from a few different parts. The first one being a critical reflection on what is the expectation around the stronger role that local governments can take. Secondly, looking at be presenting a typology of the various roles that municipalities can play in helping the implementation of renewable energy. And then finally, presenting some preliminary results that the AIRE of the work that the AIRE project has undertaken in 3 different Canadian provinces, and these will be presented as a case study. So for our presentation today, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Kirby Calvert with us today. He is an associate professor at the University of Guelph, where he leads the CCAP partnership, as well as being the co-founder and chair of the board of directors of AIRE Energy Guelph, that is working to catalyze the implementation of their own community energy initiatives. So without further ado, I would like to introduce and hand it over to Kirby.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you happen to be. As Eric said, I'm going to deliver the presentation today and would like to acknowledge Alex Chapman, who is the executive director at AIRE Energy Guelph. Many of you may know Alex. He's helping to support the research that went into the development of this presentation. We had a lot of competing demands on your attention today. We had there was an FCM conference going on, as well as a workshop that is being put together on distributed energy resources in the York region. That case study example out of the York region, and so Alex has is attending a different workshop. And sends his regards, and you'll see some of the great work that he's been doing in support of this project as we move along here. And so as Eric mentioned, there's a few parts of the presentation, and I want to start with some of the assumptions underlying the role of municipality in accelerating implementation of renewable energy. And then we'll identify some of the roles that municipalities can play and have played within their capacity. And we'll share some exemplary cases and some lessons learned. That's the survey of implementation piece of this, is sharing the exemplary cases that we find as we do the scan across the nation on the role of the municipality in accelerating implementation of renewable energy. So let's dive right in, and I want to start with some assumptions. So generally speaking, there are 2 distinct perspectives on the role of local government in energy planning and implementation, broadly speaking. And the first is what we might call a minimalist perspective. And from this perspective, there's a clear separation between what we might think of as corporate energy. So thinking about energy and renewable energy in the context of the city as a corporation, as an administrative unit, and separating that piece from what we know and what we call community energy. That is the opportunities for renewable energy that exist elsewhere in our community within city boundaries, but not necessarily through the city proper, the corporation. And so from this perspective, there's an emphasis on the factors that a municipality controls directly, its buildings, its fleets. This perspective tends to operate more as a policy taker rather than a policy maker, meaning that the municipality operates, strictly speaking, as a creature of the province and responds to provincial policies. And by the way, I'm borrowing this language from a combination of political science and governance theory that has looked at the role of municipality in all different settings and applying it here to what we know of as community energy and community energy planning. So that's one perspective. And the other perspective that we'll flesh out today is this, what we might call a comprehensive perspective. So here, a municipality emphasizes its role not only in what it directly controls, but what it also indirectly influences. And we'll talk about that as we move along here. And from this perspective, municipalities are more likely to be policy makers rather than, simply speaking, policy takers. And by that, I mean that there's an effort to supplement, strengthen provincial policies with local policies. So these are the two broad views. And I bring this up because often in our conversations about the role of municipality in energy planning broadly, but especially in accelerating the implementation of renewable energy, we might be coming from very different perspectives. And I think it's important to understand the foundation of our perspective, where we're coming from. So this is hopefully a way to frame that conversation and to frame the conversation that we'll have as we move along here. And I'll note, and this is intuitive to many of you, that community energy planning in and of itself implies a comprehensive view. And so I put a definition of community energy planning up on the slide there that I think is important for us to consider. The key parts of this definition are socially inclusive process to identify and follow pathways for change in the way that energy is produced and distributed and consumed. The socially inclusive is, I think, key in this definition. And working with and through local government to achieve those targets, I think, is the other important part of this definition. So in other words, local government is one among many stakeholders and agents of change in accelerating implementation of renewable energy, albeit the most crucial stakeholder with the largest capacity for driving that change, as we'll discuss. And we know well that, and Quest has helped us understand that across Canada, community energy planning is a social movement and a governance innovation that's more than a decade in the making. And community energy plans imply that the municipality is at least considering a comprehensive view on achieving energy, climate change, and community development targets through all of these different ways that are shown here on the screen, but especially the topic of today will be on renewable energy. And often as we get into conversations about community energy planning and what it looks like in implementation, we come across this question. So this is a question that I hear often from councillors, from citizens, and from senior staff. And so I think it's important to have some responses ready. I won't spend too much time on the why question because I think this is intuitive for a lot of us on the call, but I just want to share two responses that have become my go-to responses, so to speak, when I'm asked this question and when I hear this, and I just heard this actually almost verbatim in a community not far from me, that this problem of energy transition and climate change and community energy development is too big for us, meaning too big for the municipality. And the first response, this is largely an academic response, building on principles of effective governance and program design. It goes something like this, that community energy plans maximize benefits and minimize impacts of a transition that is already happening through what I shorthand as a down and out approach to energy transition management. So in short, the problem is exactly the right size. Community energy planning and municipalities are not driving the transition to renewable energy per se. And in a lot of ways, municipalities are reacting to it, facilitating it in ways that maximize benefits and minimize impacts for their communities. So what we mean by this is that it's a question of institutional fit, of allocating responsibility and resources to a level of government, to a public institution, to a governance entity that is closest to the problem and the challenge. Right? We all are familiar with the numbers. 60% of emissions are under the purview of municipal government in some way. We recognize that distributed energy resources are rapidly becoming the basis of our energy future. And as they are developed, they're calling into questions the very basic assumptions about urban design, land use planning, and all other matters of the municipal domain. And so, we really need a municipal government that is strong and able to respond to all of that. So that's the down piece. The out piece is public engagement and collaborative cross-sector planning. And I think we all can understand that the municipality is in and of itself does not have all of the capacity that it needs to facilitate this transition and to capture those opportunities. And often, failure to adopt new technologies and drive technological change is in some ways related to poor messaging or low awareness and or lack of trust. And a municipality at the center of broader public engagement helps to improve messaging, make it place-based, improve awareness, and ideally strengthen trust. So that's the first thing. It's responding to a transition that is already happening and helping to ensure that we maximize benefits and minimize impacts. And the other response is that municipalities have a mandate for community development, and accelerating implementation of renewable energy is a pathway to sustained and sustainable local prosperity. I think, again, this is intuitive to us, so I won't spend much time, but we'll point you to some work that came out of Quest. Rob Kerr led a project on economic impact of community energy plans and the implementation of community energy plans. And I've adapted this slide on the basis of some of that work, and we'll share with you some examples of how this has unfolded, how these economic development opportunities have unfolded in communities as a result of helping to accelerate implementation of renewable energy. And so, as I said, I think most municipalities get this. I think most people on this call get this. Community energy plans have been set across the country, and renewable energy is figuring prominently in those plans. And communities have been inspired to act. So we find ourselves with a solid foundation on which to manage the transition locally. But of course, we've experienced considerable challenge getting to implementation. That's really been the focus of a lot of the work out of Quest, and certainly the focus of the work that we're doing through the AIRE project. And among the primary points of inertia is a lack of clarity and a lack of capacity on the role of the municipality in helping to implement renewable energy. And that really brings us to the meat and potatoes of this presentation. So, assuming that all of this implies a comprehensive approach to accelerating implementation of renewable energy for a lot of the reasons I just described, what would that look like? Well, it means being prepared to take on multiple roles and a mix of actions and levers. And so I'm going to represent these different roles and different actions, the typology that we alluded to earlier, on a spectrum of involvement in the market, from high involvement or direct involvement in the renewable energy market to relatively low involvement. And so I don't mean for this to be a spectrum of better to worse. It's just a way to communicate and situate the different roles that a municipality can play in some logical way. And I've just chosen this spectrum of high to low involvement in the market. And I'll note at the bottom right of the screen there that I'm building off of some reports that have been published, as well as some academic papers that have been published that help us to conceptualize the role of municipalities and local governments in accelerating implementation. So the first category is obvious. It's implementation, growing the market through direct provision of renewable energy to meet corporate energy needs. So this fits real squarely in that corporate bin. And there's a couple of options. So the examples that I'm giving here aren't real examples. They're conceptual examples. We'll get into real examples in a minute here. But these are some of the actions and levers that can be pulled to exercise or express that role, owning and self-managing, or engaging in a supply agreement and letting someone else own and manage a system. Yeah, but a municipality as an energy consumer and as an entity that has a bit of control in some cases, in some provinces and contexts, a bit of control, a municipality can grow the market by direct provision. Alternatively, a municipality, or in addition, I should say, a municipality can invest. And this is where a municipality is participating in the market, not necessarily directly growing the market, through direct investment or indirect investment. And I'm putting indirect investment in this category, deferred revenue. An example of that might be to provide a rebate on development charges. So you're foregoing revenue and instead investing that in the future of your community and the development of renewable energy implementation. But of course, there are some traditional formal approaches to investment, like taking an equity stake in a project. The third piece is regulate, right? Change the rules. Steer the market with clear rules that direct decisions and behavior toward renewable energy development. And zoning bylaws or changing a development charge bylaw is an example of a municipality leveraging its regulatory power to steer the market. So in this case, it's not directly participating in it or implementing, but it is certainly going a long way to steer the market and help facilitate implementation of renewable energy. And the final category we'll talk about today is encourage. So this is where a municipality sends market signals, usually through soft power, such as declaring a target and stating a policy. So these are often community energy plans or sort of declarations of intent. They're statements about wanting to achieve, for example, 100% renewable energy or increasing solar power across the city. And in other cases, like that's the sort of soft power piece, right? In persuasion, but also providing some capacity building in the community. So awareness and education campaigns and human resources, as we'll talk about. So this is the way that I think about the different roles that local government can play in accelerating implementation of renewable energy. A couple of notes that I want to make before we go forward. And the first is to recognize that the specific role taken, the specific role pursued by a municipal government is dependent on a range of factors that need to be considered well before choosing a particular line of implementation, and can't possibly always be accounted for in some of the research that we'll share. But of course, it's probably obvious to you is thinking about administrative context. So your fiscal position or the authority granted to you by a provincial government will, of course, dictate and shape which particular line you would follow. The political context, the political leanings of council and community, and their risk aversion relative to specific projects and initiatives, and especially as it relates to investments and implementation, where there's money on the line, so to speak, that shapes where a particular line that you would take. And of course, the technology of interest. Different technologies have a different set of opportunities and challenges, and they require different forms of support and different types of intervention. So we always need to think about the technology and how it's best supported, and governance context. So what I mean by that is that the role of municipality changes in relation to the role of other key actors, such as utilities or community organizations that might take on a role in the overall governance framework to accelerate implementation. So all of those factors notwithstanding, I think this is a useful typology to help us understand the different roles that a municipality can play and the specific actions and levers that it can take. And the other thing to say about this is that these are, of course, not mutually exclusive, and they work together. A single program or a single initiative from a municipality will have multiple components of it that fit into different bids that I'm showing here. And I'll talk about some real examples of what that looks like. But this is how I think about it. I think about it in terms of a policy cocktail. Right? And so like any good cocktail, you have a really strong base. It's the base that lubricates the party, let's say, and gets the juices flowing. But very few people are attracted to that base alone, right? Very few people drink whiskey alone or gin alone. You got to spruce it up with some bitters or some juices, whatever the case might be, right? And so policy is no different. You might have a strong base, and that might be an investment. It might be an implementation strategy, but you also need to consider how you round out that base with other pieces. And this is how I talk about policy development and policy design in my classes as a professor. And was once pointed out to me that this might be encouraging binge drinking to the wrong community. So I've started to use this language. Think of it like a policy goulash. It's the exact same concept and exact same line of thought, but then the vegetarians got on me, so I think about policy vegetarian goulashes. But the basic idea here is that you've got to work from a really strong base. And we're building a database of various approaches from across Canada. But what I want to do today, in the time that we have, is talk about some of those really strong bases. In other words, talk about some of those really exemplary cases that have come to the fore over the course of the research that we have done. And I'm sure there are really great examples. And if you have a great example that you want us to know about and you want us to include in the research, I really encourage you to follow up with an email to make sure that it's on our radar. Because we're doing our best to cover a lot of ground here, but of course we're going to miss some things. And so we do welcome crowdsourced examples. And as I get into these examples, I won't drone on about the details of these initiatives, but I will pull forward the high points that I think are really compelling. So consider the presentation here, the rest of the presentation, to be an entry point. You can follow up with the Q&A and or your own desktop research, but of course look forward to a fuller publication of the work sometime in December. Because as we wrap up the project, we're going to have a database that provides much more detail on the examples that we're going to share. Okay, so let's get into some examples around implementation. And I'm going back to the Hamilton, Ontario here to talk about an anaerobic digestion system. And you'll see on the screen there some description of the project. What we find really innovative here, and in a lot of ways it's not innovative among institutions. A lot of institutions have used this approach, but the approach that we're highlighting here is a revolving fund to finance energy and climate projects. I think this helps to separate risk related to these projects, which makes investments and implementation a little more palatable to the more risk-averse councillors and citizens. When you can start with some small wins, use a revolving fund and build that revolving fund through small wins, and then go after something larger. And knowing that you have dedicated funding and a dedicated funding stream helps to separate risk to other funding sources and to base funds, for example. So using a revolving fund has been shown to be really quite effective. And it's also, I should step back, it's also been very effective on campus settings. Universities across the US and increasingly in Canada are also using this revolving fund approach, where you go after the small wins, small quick wins to build the fund and then expand your portfolio with the larger, riskier projects as you move along. This project here won an award from FCM actually in 2018. A biomass district energy system in Yellowknife, fueled by biomass wood pellets to heat 5 city buildings in the downtown core. Some real high points there about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and fuel costs. And the city directly invested $2 million into this system. What I find, so the investment is key, right? It always helps to know that other municipalities have invested this kind of money and have taken this leap. Whenever you're trying to develop your own programs and convince your own councillors to support these programs, it helps to be able to point at examples. What I find really important about this project is the use of biomass pellets, in other words, a local supply of fuel that can have compounding benefits as it relates to community economic development. Now, these are going to be particularly important in places like Northern Ontario and Alberta, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, where the forestry industry and forestry sector has been hit hard by a few different converging factors. The market for low-grade, what the industry would call, in quotes, low-grade wood, pulp supply. That market has dried up because less and less pulp is made is produced, I should say, in Canada. And so these are fueling district energy systems with biomass as a way to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions and cut fuel costs, but also to stimulate an economy that is really struggling at the moment, depending on where you are. So an example of an investment, this is a really cool one. This was an example of a city of Toronto, that took the leap early in this project and then eventually divested from the project. So at the time it was developed, our understanding that the City of Toronto owned about 43% of it and then took its money out. And this project is another great example of district energy designing a system and a governance approach that helps to get at really challenging markets. That is, the need for air conditioning in a downtown core. So they have, of course, the benefit of a giant lake right outside their back door, so to speak, but they're taking advantage of that location and proximity advantage by investing early in a project and helping to get it off the ground, and then letting Enwave take over. So these kinds of really innovative examples and partnerships with private industry are going to be critical as the complexity of these technologies, the development timelines on these technologies increase. And of course, in order for a private enterprise to take on that risk and to take on that complexity, it helps to have a stable partner like a municipality to get the projects realized. Another great example is the Shepherd Landfill Solar. And I think landfill solar and what I call agrivoltaics, well, not just me that calls them, this is the term in literature, agriculture, combining agriculture with photovoltaics, is going to be a really innovative approach to ground mount utility scale solar development into the future, incorporating pollinator habitat, and basically using land resources very carefully as we build out these relatively land intensive projects. And one example of that is as you see here, the Shepherd Landfill Solar, which is a partnership between the Alberta Municipal Solar Program and NMAX Energy Corp. And the city invested $1.4 million of the project costs. And also, of course, the land, this is public land that is being repurposed from what has been called a brownfield into what is now often called a bright field. And so these are for a municipality to identify these assets and to invest these assets in a project along with along with cash support is another way in which municipalities can accelerate these projects. And so it's become especially important as landfill gas declines, right? As we know, there's a limited quantity of gas that can be extracted from a landfill, and the yield declines over time. And as that happens, we can repurpose that, or at the same time, we can repurpose that to build these really innovative systems. This one for me is a national treasure, and I'll talk about why in a moment. I am biased, as I'll explain, but St. John has developed a green, this falls under the regulation category, regulates, being very clear about the rules and using those rules to facilitate implementation of renewable energy. And in St. John, they have what's called the green energy zoning bylaw. It's an amendment to the land use bylaw that creates a defined area called the green zone. And a green zone are areas where renewable energy projects can be considered. Any land, well, primarily rural resource areas, as well as natural areas, can be rezoned as such, subject to conditions specified in the bylaw. And the bylaw lays out permitted uses, conditions for access, setback distances, aesthetics, the permit process. And importantly, green energy is not considered a permanent use, which is important, right? So they do expect a decommissioning plan, and it also acknowledges the fact that a project after its 25 year life, whatever the contract is, could be pulled, and that land could go back to some natural use or some rural use if needed. I mean, of course, depending on how the system is designed. And the reason that I point this out as a national treasure is because it is a critical base of the policy cocktail. often they were projects that we're talking about, the technologies that we're talking about are relatively locally land intensive. And it's important that we are strategic about how we're going to allocate and leverage land resources to accommodate renewable energy development. And this policy is, and this bylaw, excuse me, is strategic. It gives clarity to developers. They know where they can and cannot build, and they also understand what they're going to have to do in order to convince council staff and community to let them build in particular areas. And it helps to manage competing uses on the land and competing landscape values. It stimulates a local conversation about where we want to see new wind turbines, where we want to see solar panels. And the reason that I'm biased is, as some of you might know, I'm a geographer by training. So I think a lot about place-based development. I think a lot about competing landscape values, land use change, landscape transformation. And for me, I think we need a lot more of this. We need a lot more of these types of approaches to integrating renewable energy transition planning into land use planning, because they are, given the land intensive nature of these systems and the hyper localized nature of these systems, land use planning is de facto energy planning. And I think we could, this particular bylaw is wrapped around wind turbines in particular. It's in response to a wind farm that was being developed by St. John Energy. But this could be certainly used for large solar. It could also be used for district energy systems. And a shameless plug here, that my team, when I wear a different hat as a researcher and as a service provider, my team does community mapping and participatory mapping that gathers the information that is critical to design these types of zoning procedures and to integrate land use planning into energy planning. So if you need help doing this, please feel free to reach out. But that's as far as my shameless plug will go. Related to this is Toronto's Green Standard, and Whitby has, in the Greater Toronto Area, Whitby, Ontario has also just adopted this. And it's a tiered standard that becomes more stringent over time. It's tiered development standard for new build, where the basic level standard is mandatory and incentives are offered, principally in the form of reduced development charges for exceeding that standard. So that standard increases over time, and when you exceed the standard at any given moment, you may be eligible for reduced development charges. And this has prompted some developers to reinvest that money, basically, the reduced development charges, into innovations like district energy. And that has been a very serious win to come out of this. You could imagine also having a green zoning standard attached to this as it relates to district energy. The benefit of these two options that I've just described, especially the Toronto Green Standard, is that it's what we call a flexible regulation. So the municipality isn't saying exactly how to exceed that basic level standard. It's just setting the standard and allowing the market to respond with the technologies and the processes that it will help them achieve that or exceed that standard. So in some cases, it's district energy. In others, it might be heat pumps. And there are different options. So it's not prescribing a technology. It's not prescribing a particular approach. It's a flexible regulation. And you knew that you weren't getting out of this presentation without hearing something from Guelph, Ontario, where I'm currently situated. And I just wanted to point it out as an example of Encourage, the development. It was one of the first municipalities to develop a community energy plan. And what we saw come out of that is way back in 07, 09, is that there was a lot of collaboration and cross-sector engagement within the city to help spur the acceleration of renewable energy development. So the city reduced permitting costs for rooftop solar, which was one key piece. Guelph Hydro set connection charges that were lower than other LDCs. And that was in large part a response to the fact that these entities had already been together in a room talking about community energy planning and responded accordingly. There was 50% higher uptake than the provincial average in rooftop solar when the province had its feed-in tariff program. And it also is part of the story that attracted Canadian Solar to Guelph. The fact that we had a community energy plan and we had somebody on municipal staff dedicated to implementing that plan and to answering the phone when somebody called looking for opportunities. And related to that, Halifax is doing something really cool, hiring clean energy specialists in-house, 2 of them. If anyone's looking for a job, I think these postings are currently open. And they're responsible for promoting the adoption of renewable energy in their organization, but importantly, community projects as well. And that's really key. Right? That having that early support, having the municipality take on the added costs. Right? These are going to be very knowledgeable people with particular expertise that is difficult to get. Having them situated within City Hall is, I think, going to go a long way to supporting community projects, but also innovative public-private projects. And of course, these 2 positions are mandated and guided by a strategic plan, the Halifax 2050 plan. So hopefully I gave you a sense of some of the options that you can take. The key takeaways for me here are to think about the comprehensive perspective and to make sure that we're champions for that comprehensive perspective among our staff, executive staff in particular, and council and community. Recognizing that there's multiple roles that we can play. It doesn't all have to fall on the city to implement. They can also facilitate in really creative ways through investments and regulations and encouragements. Of course, always thinking about the policy cocktail and ensuring that that blend is as effective as possible. And what I've just shared with you today is one piece of a larger puzzle. We're thinking about comprehensive municipal supports. As mentioned, there will be an underlying database and more details provided in December when we publish the larger scope of the project here. And municipal, in that larger scope, and in the process of accelerating implementation of renewable energy, we've got to think about all the other gears that need to be turning. Like enabling land use planning structures, such as the green zoning. I mean, that fits really into both categories. But for me, again, as I said, without that green zoning, without clarity on how energy is going to incorporate into land use plan and urban design, it's really difficult to keep the other gears moving. Cross-sector implementation planning, getting the utility in a room with developers, with community groups, with municipal staff across divisions is really key to this. And as inputs, we need clear resource assessments. So we need to understand what resources are available to us, where we can and cannot develop renewable energy resources under existing regulatory conditions. This is the energy mapping that I talk about often in other contexts. And we need to continuously engage community and stakeholders to help feed the planning process that ultimately will drive the other gears. And through this, I think, we can accelerate implementation of renewable energy. That's all I have as far as the presentation goes. I hope it was helpful, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kirby. Very excellent presentation, and we have had some questions rolling in. I'd also encourage everybody just to drop them in the chat, and we'll go through them now. So the first question is around facilitating widespread renewable energy adoption when there is restrictive provincial policies. The example here is the New Brunswick Municipalities Act that prevents things such as PACE programs from existing. So is there anything you've come across in the research or through this project, knowledge or experience, and how different ways to go about facilitating widespread renewable energy adoption among more restrictive acts or policies?
Yeah, it's a great question, because as de facto creatures of the province, municipalities' hands can be tied depending on what provincial policy looks like. And I mean, there's 2 things that come to mind immediately. And the first is an advocacy role. So when we think about the different roles, I'll just go back to this slide here, think about the different roles and look to encourage. One of the ways that a municipality can encourage is through advocating to the provincial government. Now, this needs to be coordinated through your municipal associations, but that's the first part of that response. And advocate based on, in my opinion, based on the arguments around community development, the community development opportunities that will arise. So if the province opens up its policies and enables municipalities, it will be de facto enabling community development. And the other is working with utilities. Some utilities, I don't want to get into a bash fest on certain utilities, but some are more open than others to entertaining these conversations. And utilities know the market better than the provincial government. And so getting utilities in your corner and really, in other words, really focusing on things you can do as a municipality to facilitate and initiate other private actors. It's my experience that restrictive provincial policies can be overcome if you've got a groundswell of private actors who are chomping at the bit to get into this market and are just not able to get into that market. And an example of this is the conversation around virtual net metering in the province of Ontario, which has come and gone. And to my understanding is potentially being considered again, largely because effective arguments have been made around the opportunities for community development that are opened up with that kind of an enabling policy.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a lot there. So thank you for that response. The next one is around, can you expand a bit just on the municipality's authority to regulate? Like we did talk about a couple things around like land use bylaws and green zoning bylaws. Is there anything else, or just even expand on that, how the municipality, what authority they would have to attack this from a regulation side?
Yeah, of course, as always, the response depends on what province you're in, but the one big one that I discussed already is land use. So taking cues from St. John. The other is in some way, it's sort of district planning. So this isn't in practice anywhere, as far as I'm aware, in Canada, but it is being considered elsewhere, and that is carbon-based zoning. In other words, you set a standard for a particular district, not just a particular development, on the amount of greenhouse gases or the amount of energy that can be used in those particular zones. Looking to the development charge bylaw is important. So how that can be modified in order to facilitate renewable energy development used to incentivize or encourage developers. In some cases, the municipality has a strong relationship and is sole shareholder of a utility. So you can leverage your authority through your local utility. And I'm also thinking about a municipality in its role as service provider. So waste services, water services in particular, they are also areas to examine, getting into some of the guts of the policies and the regulations and the financing mechanisms through which those services are provided, to ask whether or not there are things that can be tweaked. And one of the big ones in Guelph that isn't obvious to a lot of people, and this applies to all groundwater communities, is groundwater source protection laws that need to be in place in order to protect groundwater against a possible failure in a geothermal system or a geo-exchange system. But also should be considered, they are barriers to the development of geothermal and geo-exchange systems. So if you're a groundwater community with strong groundwater source protection laws, look to those to think about and provide clarity to developers on under what conditions a geothermal or a geo-exchange system can be built in a groundwater zone. And importantly, this is in a lot of ways analogous to the land use planning and the green zoning that I just described, because it provides clarity and certainty to developers about the conditions under which these systems might be developed. And a lot of groundwater protection bylaws were developed before these technologies really took off. And so they need to be reconsidered through that lens. And always remember the human resources it will take to monitor those permitting processes. So one of the other challenges that I've heard discussed in municipal settings is that in some cases you might be inundated with thousands of permits for groundwater, or sorry, for geothermal systems, geo-exchange systems. And all of those need to be permitted, and which means they all need to be reviewed carefully. And so once you start to bring into dialogue your groundwater protection bylaws with the renewable energy space and the renewable energy technologies that are emerging, you then need to consider the human resources you're going to need in order to review all of those applications, making sure that's in place as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that was very, very good response. Thank you, Kirby. So our next question is around, so we were presented with this typology and the numerous roles across it that a municipality can take. And this will have to be a bit more of a generalized response, but has there been any research into which of those categories is actually the most effective? You know, if a community was looking, or a municipality was looking to get started and they had their limited resources, which one would be a preferred route or could be the most effective option for them to pursue?
That's a great question. And at the local level, at the municipal level, that research has not been done. But we can take cues from what we know about evaluations on provincial and federal policies, where it is very clear that the strongest action a government can take is through regulation, and in particular, flexible regulations. So those that are trying as hard as possible to not be prescriptive. And I say that for two reasons. One, because it's a structural change. And if we are going to realize transformative change in our energy systems, we need transformative change and structural change in the ways that we're guiding community development and urban planning and all sorts of things. And regulations get at those structures. And the other thing I'll say is that we know that the opportunities within a municipality to implement and invest are very limited. As a corporation in any given community, as a corporation, a municipality is really quite small in terms of its, I guess it depends on the communities, but it's relatively small in terms of the total opportunity that is available for renewable energy development. And especially in the world that we live in today, amidst the COVID pandemic, municipalities have limited financial resources to make investments and need to put those financial resources into other areas of community development, understandably. And so in other words, the opportunities are out in the community. They're on land and using resources that aren't owned by the municipality or even publicly. And the investments are coming from private sector and private entities. And in order to ensure that all of those actors, those myriad actors, are driving toward the common goal of accelerating implementation of renewable energy, they need clarity and support, and that comes through regulation. And now the question then is one question at least then, is how you allocate those responsibilities to the municipal government relative to the provincial government. So what can the provincial government regulate and keep standard across the province to make investments easy? That question is certainly there, but one thing that the province can't do very well, because it just doesn't have the purview of the resources, is to take a local place-based approach to those regulations. And it shouldn't tell a municipality exactly how to value its natural assets as they relate to renewable energy relative to some of the other ecosystem services that might be provided. So it's a long way of pointing out one, and that would be regulation. But to answer the question quickly, that hasn't been studied at the local level. Those are my insights based on what I know has been studied at other levels and based on my understanding of the total opportunity corporate in the corporate sector.
Excellent. So yeah, safe to say regulation might be the strongest ingredient in our cocktail there. That's excellent answer. Thank you. So our next question is around utility involvement in this process. Larger municipalities likely have a higher percentage of them will have their own, you know, city electric utility or natural gas utility, and therefore can have more say, more control over how this works. For smaller municipalities, they are often require the support or the help of larger utilities, some provincial utilities, or, you know, depending on the region, that may not always be as, you know, flexible, responsive, or focused on local level. So how would you engage the utilities in this process to um, to drive the implementation of renewable energy as well, or how can you?
Yeah, that's the utility question is a tricky one for all sorts of reasons. And, you know, I'll go to instinct. The real basic response to that is to get them in a room and ensure that dialogue is frequent on the issue of renewable energy development, right? If it's a policy priority for your municipality, and if you've got ideas of how you want to implement, invest, regulate, encourage, the utility is a barrier or an enabler to that. And I think frequent, regular dialogue on the capacity that the utility has to unlock the potential within your municipality is key. It's the base of all of that. It obviously doesn't always work, and utilities are funny beasts because they are, I'm paraphrasing Rob Curry here actually, who's shared this insight with me. They're funny beasts because they are local and that they're in your space. But often their hands are tied, willingly or not, by provincial regulations and provincial regulators. And so they can be really tricky to work with on this file. One area of success is in the non-regulated space. And in many provinces, utilities, municipally owned or otherwise, are able to have unregulated arms of their company where they aren't as hamstrung by issues around rate base and what you can and cannot rate base. So that's an opportunity, is to think about the unregulated channel. The unregulated channel and open dialogue are the two that are coming to mind. And I say all of that with deep sympathy and understanding for the challenges on the utility side and for the challenges on the municipality side when trying to get these projects through. The other piece, I'll point to the city of Guelph as well, I guess, because that was a success story where Guelph Hydro chose to make it easier to connect rooftop solar into the system. And, you know, that was done for reasons of values and aligning values. Guelph Hydro wanted to support rooftop solar. Surely there was also an economic decision made in that. And what was important in that success story was early dialogue. The utility was at the table very early in the conversation. When we think about rolling rooftop solar out in particular, utilities know where their system is strapped, where it is already exceeding its technical capacity, and they know where it might exceed technical capacity if, you know, 10 or 12 rooftop solar projects go in within a particular neighborhood. So they can lend a lot of that really detailed, critical technical information to the process of planning and implementing renewable energy throughout the community. And utilities are going to be important actors at the table as you develop green zoning bylaws, for example. And certainly St. John Energy, the utility there, was at the table when the green zoning bylaw was created. Because it's a land use question. It's also, the other spatial dimension of that is the state of infrastructure across the community, across the service area. That's an important part of the puzzle. Early engagement, frequent engagement, connection costs, unregulated arms. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that just about covers everything. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. As we find with a lot of these things, communication and collaboration is often a big key of a lot of these processes. So with that, that's all of our questions. Looks like we're just coming in up on our end time here. So I just want to use the rest of the time to, first of all, thank Kirby. That was an excellent and very informative presentation. And then also take the time to thank each and every one of you for attending today. If you have any questions, you come to your mind later and you want answered, or want just more information about any of this, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to either Kirby or myself. So yeah, with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day, and yeah, we will call it for today. And then I guess look for part 3 of this webinar series coming November 19th at the same time window, 11 till noon Mountain Time, or 1 till 3 or 1 till 2 Eastern. And that one will focus on governance as it relates to the implementation of community energy plans. So thank you to everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Kirby.